A trembling hand reached across the counter when no one was looking. The old woman's fingers closed around a small box of pills, the same medicine she had purchased every month for 3 years. But this time, she slipped it into her worn coat pocket instead of paying. What she didn't know was that someone had seen everything, and what he would discover about those pills would shake an entire community to its core. Before we continue, hit subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Michael Brown stood in line at Riverside Pharmacy, his briefcase heavy with case files, his mind already racing through tomorrow's court appearance. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting harsh shadows across the tired faces of people waiting their turn. He had stopped here only to pick up fever medicine for his daughter, Remy, who waited at home with their neighbor, Mrs. May. 3 people ahead of him, an elderly woman with silver hair carefully arranged in a bun spoke to the pharmacy clerk. Her voice carried a tremor that seemed to shake more than just her words. "The prescription for Harold," she said. "The usual one." The clerk, a young man with indifferent eyes glued to his phone screen, barely glanced up. "That'll be $85 now. Price went up last week." The color drained from the old woman's face. Her hand, spotted with age and holding a small leather purse, froze midway to the counter. But it was $52 last month. I have exactly $52.30. "Can't help you, ma'am. New pricing from corporate." The clerk's attention had already returned to his phone. The woman's lips pressed into a thin line. She stood there for a long moment, her body swaying slightly, as though the weight of the world had suddenly doubled on her shoulders. Michael watched as she counted out the bills in her purse again, her fingers shaking, hoping perhaps that the money would multiply if she counted carefully enough. It didn't. I'll come back," she whispered, though her voice cracked on the last word. She turned away from the counter, her steps slow, each one seeming to cost her something. But she didn't leave. Instead, she drifted toward the aisles, her eyes distant, her hand clutching the empty purse against her chest. The line moved forward. Michael paid for Remy's medicine, tucked the bag under his arm, and headed toward the exit. That's when he saw it. The old woman stood near the prescription pickup area, her back to the main counter. The clerk had disappeared into the back room. She glanced left, then right, her movements quick despite her age. Her hand darted out, fingers wrapping around a familiar box on the counter, the same prescription she'd asked for. In one fluid motion, she slipped it into her coat pocket and walked toward the door, her face pale as moonlight, her eyes fixed straight ahead. Michael's heart clenched. He should look away, pretend he hadn't seen, let her disappear into the evening. But his daughter's face flashed in his mind. Remy, who trusted him to do what was right, who believed her father was a hero in a suit and tie. He cleared his throat. The old woman froze. "Ma'am," Michael said softly, stepping closer. "I think you forgot to pay for that." Her eyes met his, and in them he saw something that would visit his dreams for weeks to come, the look of a person standing at the edge of a cliff, knowing the fall was inevitable. Her hand moved to her pocket, trembling, then stopped. She said nothing. The silence stretched between them like a bridge neither wanted to cross. The pharmacy manager emerged from the back office, a stocky man with a red face and suspicious eyes. He had been watching the security monitor. Within minutes, the police arrived. The old woman, Mrs. Diana Whitmore, as Michael would soon learn, sat in a plastic chair near the pharmacy entrance, her hands folded in her lap, tears running silently down her weathered cheeks. She didn't resist. She didn't explain. She simply waited, as though she had been expecting this moment all along. Michael gave his statement to the officers with clinical precision, each word carefully chosen, emotionally neutral. But inside, something gnawed at him. The pharmacy manager insisted on pressing charges, his voice loud and indignant. speaking of loss prevention and setting examples. Diana said nothing. She signed the papers they placed before her with a steady hand, as though signing away her own life meant nothing anymore. As the officers led her out, she paused and looked back at Michael. Her eyes held no anger, no accusation, only a quiet sadness that seemed older than time itself. What could drive someone to risk everything for a box of pills? Remy was asleep when Michael arrived home, her small chest rising and falling peacefully beneath the blankets. He stood in the doorway of her room for a long moment, watching her sleep. Feeling the familiar ache of being both mother and father to a 7-year-old girl who still sometimes called for her mama in her dreams. His wife, Jane, had died 3 years ago. Cancer that spread too fast, that stole too much, that left him fumbling through parenthood alone. He had learned to braid hair through YouTube videos, to distinguish between different princess characters, to read the same bedtime story 15 times without losing his patience. Michael couldn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table with a cup of coffee growing cold between his hands, thinking about Diana Whitmore's face, about the way she had counted her money twice, hoping for a miracle, about the quiet resignation in her eyes when the police arrived. The next morning, a courier delivered an envelope to his office. Inside was a handwritten letter on paper, so thin it was nearly transparent. Mr. Brown, my name is Diana Whitmore. You witnessed my mistake yesterday at the pharmacy. I cannot afford a lawyer, but I was told I might represent myself if I choose. I am writing to ask if you would consider taking my case. I have no money to pay you. I have nothing to offer except my word that I will do whatever work you ask of me to repay the debt. I understand if you refuse. I am guilty of what they say I did. But I am writing anyway because I am desperate, and desperate people must try even when trying seems foolish. My husband Harold is dying. That is not an excuse, only the truth. Sincerely, Diana Whitmore. Michael read the letter 3 times. The words were simple, honest, bare of any manipulation or plea for sympathy. He thought about Jane in those final weeks, about the medicine that had cost hundreds of dollars per dose, about insurance companies, and the exhausting maze of healthcare bureaucracy. He thought about what he might have done if Remy's life had hung in the balance and he'd had no other choice. He picked up his phone and made the call. Diana Whitmore lived in a small house on the eastern edge of town, where the streets turned to gravel and the houses hunched close to the ground. The door hung slightly crooked on its hinges. Before he could knock, it opened. Diana stood there, smaller than he remembered, wearing a faded blue dress that had been mended at the seams more than once. Her eyes were red-rimmed but dry. She stepped aside to let him enter. The house smelled of old wood and medicine and something faintly sweet. The furniture was sparse but clean, everything worn but cared for with obvious devotion. On a side table sat a collection of photographs in mismatched frames, a young Diana in a wedding dress, beaming at a tall man with kind eyes. The same couple, older now, standing in front of a garden. More photos, decades passing in increments, faces aging, but the same 2 people, always together. Harold is sleeping, Diana said quietly, gesturing toward a closed door at the end of a narrow hallway. The medicine helps him sleep. That's mostly what it does now. They sat at a small kitchen table. Diana made tea with careful, practiced movements, her hands steadier now than they had been at the pharmacy. When she finally sat across from him, Michael opened his notebook and asked the questions lawyers ask. Diana answered each one with quiet honesty. Yes, she had stolen the medicine. Yes, she knew it was wrong. Yes, she had done it because the price had increased beyond what she could afford. She and Harold lived on his small pension and her Social Security check. They had no children, no family nearby, no safety net except each other. Harold's condition had been deteriorating for 3 years. The medicine, A prescription for a rare autoimmune disorder had been $52 a month, a sum they could just barely manage. But last month, the price had jumped to $85, then this month to $93. "I tried to explain to them," Diana said, her voice steady despite the pain evident in her eyes. "I asked if there was a generic version, or a payment plan, or anything. They said no. Just that the price was what it was, and if I couldn't afford it, Harold would have to make do without." "What happens if Harold doesn't take the medicine?" Diana's hands tightened around her teacup. "He gets worse. His body attacks itself. He can't breathe well. He can't move without pain. The medicine keeps him stable. It doesn't cure him, but it keeps him alive. For a little while longer." Michael wrote everything down, his pen moving quickly across the page. Then Diana said something that made his pen stop moving. "The strange thing is, Mr. Brown, the medicine never seems to work as well as it should. Harold takes it every day, the same dose, and it helps. But it never helps enough. 3 years ago, when he first started taking it, the doctor said that most patients see significant improvement within 6 months. Some even go into remission. But Harold just stays the same. Not better, not worse. Just balanced on a knife's edge, needing the medicine to stay there." Michael looked up from his notes. Something cold touched the back of his neck. "Have you asked his doctor about that?" "Many times. He always says Harold's case is unusual, that some patients respond differently, that we should be grateful the medicine works at all." Diana's eyes, pale blue and clear as winter sky, met his. "But I've been married to Harold for 47 years, Mr. Brown. I know when something doesn't make sense. And this doesn't make sense." He thought about the pharmacy manager's insistence on pressing charges, about the sudden price increases, about a medicine that kept patients stable but never healed them. But he had no proof of anything except an old woman's suspicion and a lawyer's instinct that something was wrong. The preliminary hearing was set for 2 weeks later. Michael spent those weeks building Diana's defense methodically, carefully, leaving nothing to chance. He filed motions, gathered character witnesses, prepared arguments about desperation and necessity and the impossible choices poverty forces on the elderly. But at night, after Remy had gone to bed, he found himself researching pharmaceutical pricing, autoimmune disorders, prescription regulations. He called doctor friends, pharmacist acquaintances, anyone who might help him understand the medical details Diana had mentioned. One former colleague, a woman who had left law to become a medical researcher, said something that stuck with him. "If you really want to know what's going on with a prescription," she told him over the phone, "don't just look at what it does. Look at what it doesn't do. Look at what would happen if the patient stopped taking it. And then ask yourself who benefits from them never stopping." Michael thought about that conversation while reviewing Diana's case files late one evening. Remy was at a sleepover, the house quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. He pulled out the pharmacy records he'd subpoenaed, spreading them across his desk. The price increases were documented clearly. $52 for 36 months, then a jump to $85, then $93. But it was the prescription history that caught his attention. Harold Whitmore had filled the same prescription every single month for exactly 3 years. Never early, never late. Always the same dosage, the same quantity, the same medication. Michael pulled up his laptop and began searching for the drug's name. Immunostat. He found the manufacturer's website easily enough, a pharmaceutical company called Atlas Health Solutions. Then he found something buried in a medical journal article, a study from 4 years ago that mentioned Immunostat in passing. The study noted that patients taking the medication showed improvement in symptoms, but rarely achieved full remission, requiring continuous treatment to maintain stability. The lead researcher had recommended further investigation into whether the drug's formulation might be modified to improve long-term outcomes. There had been no follow-up study. Michael sat back in his chair, his mind racing. He thought about what the researcher had said. Look at who benefits from them never stopping. He thought about Diana's observation that Harold never got better, only stayed balanced. He thought about price increases that made the medication barely affordable, forcing families to choose between medicine and food. He thought about a system that might be designed not to heal, but to maintain. It was past midnight when Michael finally closed his laptop. He had no proof of wrongdoing, only questions and suspicions, and a growing conviction that this case was about something much larger than an elderly woman stealing a box of pills. But suspicions weren't admissible in court, and powerful corporations had armies of lawyers to bury uncomfortable questions under mountains of procedure and technicality. What he needed was evidence, and someone brave enough to provide it. Michael hired a private investigator named Dennis Larvey, a former pharmaceutical sales representative who had left the industry under circumstances he declined to discuss, but which had left him with extensive knowledge and no love for his former employers. Dennis pulled financial reports, prescription databases, patent filings. He interviewed former employees, talked to doctors, gathered testimonials from patients. What emerged was a pattern so subtle that only someone looking for it would notice. Patients taking immunostat reported improvement in symptoms within the first few months, enough to prove the medication worked. But none achieved full remission. All required continuous treatment. Attempts to reduce dosage or transition to alternative medications typically resulted in symptom relapse. Dennis found documentation of early clinical trials where researchers had noted this effect and recommended follow-up studies to improve the formulation. Those studies had been discontinued after Atlas acquired the patent. Internal memos suggested the decision was financial. Why invest in improving a product that was already profitable and had a guaranteed customer base? It's not illegal, Dennis explained, spreading documents across Michael's desk. They're not selling snake oil. The drug does what it claims to do, manages symptoms, improves quality of life. They're just not motivated to make it do more than that. Why cure a patient when you can treat them indefinitely? Michael felt something cold settling in his stomach. That can't be ethical. Ethics and legality aren't always the same thing. Pharmaceutical companies are businesses. A drug that cures a condition means you sell it once per patient. A drug that manages a condition means you sell it every month for years, maybe decades. The breakthrough came from Dr. Raymond, a research pharmacologist who had been part of the original team that developed immunostat before it was sold to Atlas. They met at a coffee shop near his university campus. I wondered when someone would start asking questions, he said, after Michael explained why he'd called. I've been waiting years for this conversation. You knew the drug was designed to maintain rather than cure. Not designed that way, Dr. Raymond corrected. It evolved that way. Our original formulation showed promise for full remission in early trials. When Atlas bought the patent, they reformulated it. Nothing illegal, just subtle changes to make manufacturing cheaper. The new version worked almost as well, but in those small differences, something changed. Patients stabilized but didn't improve beyond a certain point. And you reported this? Dr. Raymond's laugh was bitter. I tried. I wrote memos, presented data, argued for additional research. I was told that the drug met FDA standards for safety and efficacy, which it does. It's safe, it's effective, it's just not optimal, and optimal isn't required by law. Would you be willing to testify to this, in court, on the record? Dr. Raymond met his eyes. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then the doctor nodded slowly. Yes. If it means something might actually change, yes. They had their witness. They had their evidence. They had the beginning of a case that could reshape how people thought about pharmaceutical ethics and patient care. But having evidence and winning a case were two different things, especially when the opponent had money, lawyers, and everything to lose. Within a week of Michael's conversation with Dr. Raymond, Atlas Health Solutions filed a motion to dismiss Diana's case, offering to drop all charges in exchange for her silence on all matters related to Immunostat. The offer came with a confidentiality agreement and a settlement check large enough to cover Harold's medication for 5 years. Diana called Michael in tears. "They're offering us so much money. Harold could have his medicine. We could stop worrying. I don't want to be selfish, but he's my husband, and he's dying, and I'm so tired of being afraid." Michael sat in his office with the phone pressed to his ear, listening to this woman who had committed one desperate act and somehow found herself at the center of something much larger than herself. He thought about telling her to take the deal, to save Harold, to let someone else fight this battle. But he thought about Remy growing up in a world where medicine was a commodity rather than a right, where profit mattered more than healing. He thought about Jane, about the fortune they'd spent on treatments that prolonged her suffering without offering hope of cure. "Mrs. Whitmore," he said slowly, "I can't tell you what to decide. This is your life, your husband's life. If you take the settlement, no one would blame you." "But," Diana prompted, hearing what he wasn't saying. "But if we go forward, if we bring this to trial and make it public, we might be able to help not just Harold, but hundreds or thousands of other people trapped in the same situation. Or we might lose and gain nothing except the knowledge that we tried." "Yes, that's possible." The line went silent for a long time. When Diana finally spoke, her voice was steadier than he expected. "Harold and I have been married for 47 years. We've survived on love and stubbornness, and the belief that doing right matters more than doing easy. If I take their money now and stay silent, what does that say about those 47 years? She paused. "Tell them no. Tell them we're going to trial." Michael felt something expand in his chest. Pride, admiration, fear. "Are you sure?" "No. But I'm going to do it anyway." Remy noticed her father's absence even when he was home. She stopped asking him to play, stopped showing him drawings from school, retreated into quiet watchfulness. One night, he found her sitting on the stairs, eavesdropping on a phone call with Dennis. He ended the call and sat beside her. "Hey kiddo, past your bedtime. Are you going to lose your case?" she asked. "I might. Sometimes you fight for things, even when you might lose. Why? Because some things are important enough to fight for, even when fighting is hard." Remy leaned against his shoulder. "I miss Mama." "Me too, sweetheart. If you had medicine that could have saved her, would you have stolen it?" The question caught him off guard. He thought about Diana's trembling hand reaching for that box of pills, about the desperation that drove a law-abiding woman to break the law. "Yes," he said honestly, "I would have. Then Mrs. Whitmore isn't bad. She just loves Mr. Fulbarkor. Whitmore like you loved Mama. That's right. So you have to help her, because helping people who love each other is the most important thing." Michael hugged his daughter close, feeling the simple clarity of her understanding cut through all his adult complications and doubts. The night before the trial, Michael visited Harold and Diana. The old man was awake for once, propped up in bed, his breath shallow but his eyes alert. "Thank you," Harold said, his voice barely above a whisper, "for giving us a chance to matter." "You already matter," Michael replied. Harold shook his head slowly. "We've been invisible for so long. Poor people are always invisible. But maybe, for a little while, people will see us." The courtroom filled early on the first day of trial. Word of the case had spread. Patients taking Immunostat filled the gallery. Elderly couples who recognized their own story in Diana's. Local reporters occupied the press section, notebooks ready. Atlas Health Solutions brought a team of 5 lawyers, all expensive suits and polished confidence. Their lead counsel, Jonathan Pittman, was a man Michael had heard of, but never faced, a specialist in pharmaceutical litigation, with a reputation for never losing. Michael sat beside Diana, who wore the same dark dress from the preliminary hearing, her hands folded in her lap, her face pale but composed. Behind them, Harold sat in a wheelchair, oxygen tubes running to his nose, determined to witness what his wife was fighting for. Judge Martinez called the court to order. Pittman stood before the jury with commanding presence. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're here today because Mrs. Whitmore stole medication from a pharmacy. That's the crime. That's what we're here to address. The defense wants to turn this into something larger, to accuse a respected pharmaceutical company of wrongdoing based on nothing more than suspicion and anecdote. Don't be distracted. The law was broken, and there must be consequences." Then it was Michael's turn. He walked to the center of the courtroom and looked at the jury. 12 faces stared back at him. Tired people who had their own problems, their own bills, their own reasons to distrust lawyers, and complicated arguments. "Your Honor, members of the jury," he began, "my name is Michael Brown, and I'm here today to tell you a story about medicine that doesn't heal, about prices that climb beyond reach, and about a system that treats sick people not as patients to be cured, but as customers to be maintained." Samako Whitmore did steal medication. She admits that. But before you judge her, I ask you to understand why she acted, and to consider what her desperation reveals about the medicine she was trying to save her husband's life with. For the next 3 hours, Michael methodically built his case. He called Dr. Raymond to explain how Immunostat had been reformulated in ways that reduced its effectiveness. He called former Atlas employees who testified about internal discussions, prioritizing profit margins over patient outcomes. He called other patients who described the same pattern Harold experienced: improvement followed by plateau, dependence, but never remission. He presented financial documents showing how Atlas had deliberately structured pricing to maximize long-term revenue. He showed the jury emails, memos, strategic plans that revealed a company carefully calculating how much they could extract from desperate people. When Diana took the stand, Michael kept his questions simple. "Mrs. Whitmore, tell the jury about your husband." She spoke for 20 minutes, her voice steady despite her trembling hands. She described 47 years of marriage, of partnership, of facing hardship together. She described watching Harold decline, seeing him struggle to breathe, knowing each month might be his last. "I knew it was wrong to steal," she said finally. "I knew it even as I did it. But in that moment, faced with losing the person I'd spent my whole life with, faced with knowing I could save him if only I had $85 I didn't have, I chose wrong over losing him. I don't ask you to excuse that. I just ask you to understand it." Pittman's cross-examination was brutal. He questioned her judgment, her priorities, her decision to break the law rather than seek legitimate assistance. But Diana didn't break. She answered every question honestly, admitted every fault, and somehow maintained a quiet dignity that no amount of aggressive questioning could diminish. The turning point came when Dennis Larvey testified, presenting data he'd compiled over weeks of investigation. "I analyzed prescription patterns for Immunostat over the past 5 years," Dennis explained, presenting charts. 93% of patients remain on the medication indefinitely. Among those who attempt to reduce dosage or switch to alternatives, 87% return within 6 months due to symptom relapse. This pattern is unusual compared to other autoimmune medications, which typically show higher rates of remission or successful transition to maintenance doses. "What does that suggest to you?" Michael asked. "It suggests the medication is designed to create dependency, not physical addiction, but functional dependency. Patients need it to remain stable, but it never provides enough improvement for them to reduce dosage or transition off it. It's the pharmaceutical equivalent of a subscription service. You can never cancel because canceling means suffering." On the 4th day, closing arguments began. pitman reframed the entire trial as a distraction from Diana's crime. No matter how sympathetic Mrs. Whitmore's situation, no matter what questions might exist about pharmaceutical pricing, the fundamental fact remains: she broke the law. If we excuse theft because someone needs what they're stealing, we open the door to chaos. Then Michael stood for his closing argument. He had prepared a careful speech, but as he looked at Diana sitting small and quiet at the defendant's table, at Harold struggling for each breath, at the packed gallery of people whose lives depended on medicines they could barely afford, he set his notes aside. "Members of the jury," he said quietly, "the prosecution is right. Mrs. Whitmore broke the law. She stole medicine from a pharmacy. Those are the facts. But facts without context are just numbers on a page. So let me give you context. Mrs. Whitmore is 73 years old. She has never committed a crime in her life. She and her husband have been married for 47 years. Through poverty and illness, and all the hardships that come with growing old, in a country that has forgotten its elderly exist. For 3 years, she bought the same medicine every month to keep her husband alive. She paid what they asked without complaint, even as the price climbed higher and higher. And then, one month, the price jumped beyond what she could afford. She asked for help. She was told no. She asked for alternatives. She was told there were none. She asked for mercy. She was told the price was what it was. So she took it. Not because she wanted to, not because she believed she was entitled to, but because the alternative was watching her husband die when she had the power to prevent it. He paused, letting the words settle. The prosecutor says excusing her theft opens the door to chaos. I say condemning her for loving her husband enough to break an unjust law opens the door to something worse. A world where human compassion is a crime, where choosing love over legality makes you a criminal, where corporations can exploit desperation and call it business. Mrs. Whitmore isn't asking you to excuse her actions. She's asking you to understand why she acted and to consider what your verdict says about who we are as a society, about what we value, about whether we believe justice means punishing the desperate or holding accountable the systems that make desperation inevitable. The courtroom was silent when he finished. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, their faces revealed nothing. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" Judge Martinez asked. The foreman stood. "We have, Your Honor." "On the charge of theft, how do you find the defendant?" "Not guilty, Your Honor." The courtroom erupted. Harold's oxygen monitor beeped frantically as he tried to stand from his wheelchair. Diana covered her face with her hands, her shoulders shaking. The gallery of patients and supporters cheered, but Michael barely heard any of it. He was focused on Pittman, on the Atlas legal team, on the shock and fury in their expressions. They had lost the criminal case, but this wasn't over. Atlas wouldn't accept defeat quietly. And yet, for this moment, justice had been served. Not the clean, simple justice of law books, but the messy, complicated justice of human beings trying to do right in an imperfect world. 3 months after the trial, Michael sat in his office reviewing documents for a class action lawsuit against Atlas Health Solutions. The verdict in Diana's case had opened floodgates, patients across the country coming forward with their own stories. The lawsuit was massive, complex, potentially years in the making, but it was moving forward. Remy appeared in his office doorway, backpack slung over one shoulder. "Daddy, can we visit Mrs. Whitmore? She said she has cookies." Michael checked his watch. He had 3 more hours of work scheduled, but he looked at his daughter's hopeful face and remembered what she'd told him. Helping people who love each other is the most important thing. "Let's go," he said, closing his laptop. They drove to Diana's house, where Harold sat on the front porch in his wheelchair, looking stronger than Michael had seen him in months. The pharmaceutical company, pressured by negative publicity, had provided his medication free of charge pending the lawsuit's resolution. Diana greeted them with genuine warmth, ushering Remy inside to see the cookies she'd baked. Michael sat beside Harold on the porch, watching the afternoon sun paint gold across the worn houses of this forgotten neighborhood. "How are you feeling?" Michael asked. "Alive," Harold replied simply, "which is more than I expected a few months ago." They sat in comfortable silence. Then Harold spoke again. "Diana tells me you're still fighting them, that you haven't given up even though our case is done. There's more work to do. Your case opened doors. Now we have to make sure they stay open. It'll cost you time, money, stress. Remy needs her father present, not buried in legal battles." "I know. I'm trying to balance it." Harold nodded slowly. "Jane would be proud of you. Diana told me about your wife, about what you went through. You could have become bitter, could have focused only on protecting yourself and Remy. Instead, you're fighting for strangers. That takes courage." Michael felt his throat tighten. "I just want things to be better. For Remy, for all the kids growing up. I don't know if I can change anything, but I have to try." "You already have changed things," Harold said quietly. "You changed them for us. You gave us back our dignity, our belief that we matter. That's worth more than you know." Remy emerged from the house with chocolate smudged on her cheek. "Mrs. Whitmore's teaching me to bake." Michael watched his daughter's delight, felt the warmth of the afternoon sun, saw Diana and Harold exchange a glance full of the accumulated tenderness of nearly 5 decades together. These moments, small, ordinary, precious, were what all the fighting was really about. Not abstract principles or legal precedents, but the simple right of people to live with dignity, to care for those they loved, to grow old without being crushed by systems that valued profit over humanity. The class action lawsuit would take years. Atlas would fight every step. Some battles would be won, others lost. The systemic problems that had created Diana's desperation would persist long after this particular case resolved. But Harold would have his medicine. Diana would keep her home, and thousands of people who had felt invisible and powerless would know that sometimes, when someone stands up and fights back, justice was possible. Not guaranteed, not easy, but possible. And possibility was sometimes enough to build hope on. As he drove home with Remy chattering about cookie recipes, Michael thought about the question she'd asked him weeks ago. Would he have stolen medicine to save Jane? Yes, without hesitation. That desperation, that willingness to sacrifice everything for love, was what made humans human. The system that forced people to make such choices was what made them cruel. He couldn't fix the system alone. He couldn't cure every illness, or right every wrong, or save everyone who needed saving. But he could stand beside people like Diana and Harold, could amplify their voices, could use his skills to fight for those who had neither. He could teach Remy that justice was something you worked toward, not something you waited to receive. He could honor Jane's memory by trying to build a world where other families wouldn't face the impossible choices that had defined their final months together. It wasn't enough. It would never be enough. But it was something. And on days when the weight of everything felt crushing, when the odds seemed impossible and the victories too small to matter, Michael would remember Harold sitting on that porch, alive and grateful, and Diana teaching his daughter to bake cookies, and the jury foreman standing to say, "Not guilty," in a voice that shook with emotion. He would remember that sometimes the battles you can't win are still worth fighting, that sometimes standing up matters more than the outcome, that sometimes love and stubbornness and the belief that people deserve better are enough to change at least one small corner of the world. And for now, for today, that was enough.